I am really happy to welcome all of you today to, a little bit more of a formal online retreat. We've done some informal short online retreats over recent months at Mount Olivet Conference and Retreat Center. And this is a little bit more of a formal workshop conversation. And I'm thrilled to invite you to that. We'll be doing some more of those in the upcoming months as we continue to adjust how we connect and learn and grow and share our faith together in the midst of this global pandemic. So for those of you who might not know me, I don't think we have all Mount Olivet folks at least signed up for this workshop. For those of you who might not know me, I'm Teresa Latini, and I'm the Executive Director at Mount Olivet Conference and Retreat Center. The Retreat Center has been in existence for over 40 years, and our mission and ministry has been to nurture the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual growth of all people in a space of natural beauty. And in the midst of this pandemic, we are continuing to carry out that ministry in new and creative and hopefully increasingly effective ways as we all learn to manage some of these new ways of connecting. I am really thrilled also today to be able to introduce you to Reverend Becca Erhlich. Becca is a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She has served in a number of capacities, including on the admissions staff for a period of time at United Lutheran Seminary, where I got to know her well. She's currently on the staff of, I believe, Allegheny Synod in Pennsylvania. She has done work, her work around prayer that kind of infuses everything that she does as a pastor has been inspiring to me. I've so appreciated kind of who she is as a worship leader, a prayer, and most recently, how she has launched herself a blog and promotion of Christian Minimalism, which is another way of saying she's taken Marie Kondo and a lot of what Marie Kondo talks about in terms of simplifying our lives, our living spaces. And Becca has really thought about this in light of our Christian faith, in light of a Lutheran faith, and has really made it more broad to think about this as a whole lifestyle as Christians. What does it mean to practice this discipline of simplicity, as I sometimes think about it, going back to my years, many, many years ago, of reading a book, a classic by Richard Foster on the spiritual disciplines, and simplicity was talked about. It's like, how do we have not a simplistic life, but a simple life? So I am thrilled to introduce you to Becca today and have her share with us, and I'm thrilled to learn from her. I'm sitting in an office that's a little more simple than it was a few months ago in preparation for today, as well as for living and working at home.
So welcome to Simplifying Our Lives and Living Spaces, also known as what I call Christian minimalism. First of all, jump in. What do you think minimalism is?
Having some perspective on stuff.
Okay, cool. That's a great place to start. Thank you for jumping in and being the first. Anyone else? Well, usually what people think of when they think of minimalism is this. It's a room devoid of color and one chair that's also devoid of color. And this is actually not what minimalism is. It's funny because minimalism originally was a design term, and this is kind of what minimalism was, and now it's become a lifestyle, and this is not what minimalism the lifestyle is. I can promise you that. You can tell by looking at what I'm wearing as a Christian minimalist. It doesn't mean being devoid of color or being boring. You can still have color. It just means that we live a more simplistic, pared down lifestyle. What I usually say minimalism is a focus on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else. thoughts or questions on that?
You know, it's a much broader definition than I anticipate. So focusing on all the aspects of life that matter most. I mean, that's like taking a look at one's whole life, not just my office that I mentioned before. So it's
Yep.
more encompassing.
Yep. It's an all-inclusive lifestyle. Yeah. And we usually think of the stuff, right? Because that's the obvious place we need to simplify usually. And a lot of times minimalists start with the stuff because it's easier than other things, but it's an all-encompassing lifestyle, as you said. Any other thoughts on this definition? Well, we'll see if people have thoughts as we continue. So obviously, if minimalism is a focus on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else, we have to ask, what are the aspects of life that matter most? Anyone want to guess? What do you think matters most in life?
Relationships.
Relationships, yeah. And every time I give this presentation, that is the first thing people say. We all know that our relationships with other people are one of the things that matter most in life, for sure. Anyone else want to take a crack at some of the other things? I'll give you a hint. These aspects of life tend to be across the board in all cultures and geographies. So it's not something specific to American culture.
Shelter, security.
Yeah. Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Yep. Other guesses? Well, the minimalists, who are two guys, Ryan Nicodemus and Joshua Fields Milburn, who call themselves the minimalists, and they do branding very well. They have a podcast, they have multiple social media accounts, they've had multiple books. This is what they say matters most: health, relationships, passion, growth, and contribution. Thoughts on this? Is this what you expected when you heard what matters most in life?
Say that faith should also be in there. You know, your faith world, your faith life, your, faith in God.
Yes, that, and we will talk about that because that was one of my big things, was connecting it to faith. They come from it from a secular perspective, so they talk about spirituality like as a general term. But they don't necessarily talk about it as faith being one of the main components, which is weird to me as a Christian. But for them, they talk to a wider audience. But you're right. So if that's the list, if we went by that list, what gets in the way of us focusing on the aspects of life that matter most? Well, here's some things that get in the way. Material possessions and upkeep, for sure. How many of us have way more things than we need and could definitely pare down? Show of hands. Yeah, a good chunk of us. Money spending habits. We might not be fully aware of how we're spending our money, or ways that we can more effectively spend our money. Time and energy spending habits. This isn't something we usually think about, but a lot of times we're not necessarily spending our time and energy on the things that matter most. Sometimes we take on too much. Anyone done that? I know I've done that. Bite off more than you can chew as far as obligations go. That gets in the way of focusing on what matters most. Other thoughts? What are some other things that are obstacles from helping us focus on what matters most? You think of anything else? Is this a good list? I see some nodding. Okay, good. I'm trying to scroll through everybody as I go, so. Great. So minimalism aims to cut through the clutter and focus on what really matters so that we don't have those obstacles. So the important thing is identifying what's most important. We talked about the aspects of life that matter most, intentionally removing everything else that isn't those things. And that includes minimizing, decluttering, getting rid of stuff and commitments. But it also includes intentional consumption of goods, time, and energy, and all of those things as well. So it's a lot of times the decluttering movement is just one step. right? Like it's super trendy to be like, I'm decluttering. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's also that other flip side of the coin of also being intentional with consumption. Because if you're not being intentional with consumption, you're just going to accumulate time and energy and stuff again, right? Like you're just going to accumulate all those things again. If we do all this, if we do those steps, it means that we have freedom of more time, energy, and financial resources to focus on what matters most. Sounds good, right? Sounds good to me. I mean, wouldn't you want more time and energy and resources to focus on what matters most? Yeah. So one of the things I always focus on for folks when I talk about minimalism is that there's no right way to be a minimalist. There's no like specific steps or you're a minimalist if you do these things and you're not a minimalist if you don't do these things. That's not a thing. It's prescriptive rather than restrictive. And what I mean by that is it's a lifestyle that can be adjusted for your personal context and current life situation. So for example, if you have 2 kids, minimalism is going to look very different than if you live by yourself. It just is, right? Or if you live with a partner, or you live with a roommate, or, all those things. There are minimalists who, own houses and cars. And then there are minimalists who own only things in their bag and travel the world. Well, maybe not now. They're probably staying put now. And everything in between. Minimalists are a wide range. What it really just means is we're aiming to focus on what matters most and remove the other things that keep us from doing that. That's all that being a minimalist means. Questions or comments on that? Hold on, my computer. There we go. All right. So I thought maybe I could tell you a little bit about how I ended up discovering minimalism and a little bit about my journey. Does that sound good? Good, because I was going to do it anyway. So I was living in Gettysburg at the time, and we had just moved from a 3,000 square foot house in Buffalo to a 1,200 square foot apartment. And if you know anything about living in a larger house, you tend to fill the space. It was just me and my husband, but we had a whole lot of stuff because, when you have that many square feet, it looks weird if you have nothing in there. Or so we thought, right? Like now I'm like, I'll have empty rooms and it's totally fine. But at the time I was like, oh shoot, we have this huge room and nothing to put in it. Let's buy some stuff to put in there. So when we moved to this smaller apartment, we had way more stuff than could fit in there. So we rented a storage unit. So we had a storage unit outside of town that was what they call high and tight, which means it was all the way up to the top and all the way from side to side and back to front. So literally, even if we wanted to get something out of the storage unit, we couldn't because it was super tight. So we put all that stuff in storage unit, and then like there were stuff in nook and crannies everywhere in our apartment. I mean, it was nuts. There was just nowhere, and it was a 3-bedroom apartment, and we still had stuff everywhere. I have a chronic illness, and I was having a bad illness day, and it was my day off. And I was browsing through Netflix. And if you know anything about Netflix, it recommends things for you. And I watch a lot of documentaries. And it recommended this documentary that you see up here, Minimalism, a documentary about the important things. And I was like, I have no idea what that means, but it's an hour and 15 minutes. And if I hate it, it's an hour and 15 minutes of my life that is okay. Like it's only an hour and 15 minutes. So I put it on. And it ended up changing my life, which is weird because when you watch Netflix, you don't expect your life to change typically. Usually you're just expecting to hang out for a bit. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is something I think I really need to pursue. And so my husband, Will, came home from running errands. And I said, Will, I just watched this amazing documentary about minimalism. And I think you need to watch it because I think this is something God might be calling us to. And he was very hesitant because he didn't want things to change. He was like, oh, I don't know about that. I said, no, trust me. So we watched it together and he had the same reaction I did. He said, oh my gosh, I think this is something God is calling us to. Thank goodness. So we decided to start this journey. I started a blog mostly for accountability and just to record things. I didn't expect people outside of like, you know, my family and friends would ever read it. Turns out a lot of other people are interested in this and simplifying their lives, which is great. And so I started this blog. And then in addition to that, we started with stuff. As I said before, minimalists tend to start with stuff because it tends to be a lot easier to start there versus starting with, say, commitments or other things in your life. And so we tackled our apartment and storage unit, and we donated almost everything, and then things that weren't worth donating we threw out. But we pared down and got rid of 60% of our stuff in 6 months. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it wasn't a glamorous process. You just go through and you're like, does this add value to my life? And if it doesn't, you know, you're like, will this add value to someone else's life? If the answer is yes, then donate it, you know? So we worked really hard. We got that done, and it worked out. The timing was good because we started this and then I found out I was moving to Philadelphia. So we were like, oh shoot, we have to really get rid of all this stuff. So we had a time frame in place when we found out we were moving, which was good. But I always suggest doing a time frame because otherwise you could just, you know, do this forever. And that is what we did. And so I'll talk more. I did a shopping fast for a year. I did not buy things except essentials for a year, which I'll talk more about a little later, in addition to doing this as well. And then we also started paring down, you know, time commitments, energy suckers, things that aren't focused on what matters most to us. And quite frankly, with the time and energy I spent with upkeep of stuff, and things that weren't focusing on the aspects of life that matter most, like I've been working on my doctorate, like in the time that I saved from doing that, which is kind of incredible. So that's a little bit about my story. Do you have any questions or comments?
Becca, this is Teresa, and maybe you'll get into this in a little later, but I mean, it would be lovely to hear from you about kind of like practically, how did you go about getting rid of 60% of everything you had? I mean, I heard that you had to go from a 3,000 square foot house down to a tiny apartment, but I mean, everything from like, what practices helped you to, how did you do that with a partner? Because, you know, that's not always easy either, because people value different things in different ways. And how did you do that? And so that would be my question. And let's just pause for a second and see, are there any other questions that it would be helpful for others to have addressed?
This is Karen speaking. I went to your website and looked at some of the blogs, and I know the one about sentimental things is really of interest to me, and I assume that you will probably talk about that more in your presentation. We might talk about that a little bit more. I think that's one of the most difficult things for downsizing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sometimes that comes up a little farther down the road, but we can talk about that now as well.
Not necessarily now. I just wanted to say, when you asked about what things we'd like to be included.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So one of the things a lot of times I get asked is the practical stuff. And I wish there was like a guidebook, but there isn't, because right, everybody's going to decide what adds value to their life different than other people. So basically that's what I did. A lot of people start, like Marie Kondo says, to start with the stuff you have the most of, because then you'll see your progress and you can keep going. And I kind of agree with her on that. I disagree with her on a lot of other things, but that I agree with her on that. And so that's usually like clothes and books and things like that. You might have something else that you have a lot of personally, but I started with clothes. And some of the practical things I did was like, does this still fit me? Is this worn out? You know, that sort of thing. But then also, like, is this something I love wearing? Like, do I enjoy wearing this? Is this something I feel good in? And so the great part about that is I probably pared down my wardrobe to 1/3 the size of what it was previously. And so when I walk into my closet, everything fits me and everything's my favorite. So it's not like that, you know, when you walk into your closet and you're like, I have nothing to wear. I don't feel that anymore because I only have my favorites in there, which is great. Somebody said, and I don't know if this is statistically proven, but someone said that we tend to use 20% of our wardrobe, like what's in our closet. So we wear 20% of our wardrobe like 80% of the time. So basically saying we could pare our wardrobe down to 1/3 or 1/4, you know, and it would still serve us well. We would still have more than enough. And actually, if you think about it, at like the turn, not the turn of our century, right, but the turn of the other century, people only had like 3 outfits. Like that was a thing. And I'm not saying we should go back to that, but for some reason now we think we need more than we actually do as far as clothing and other possessions go. And so we started small. I started with clothes, but there's other ways. A lot of times, if I didn't have a ton of time to do it, like, you know, on a Saturday, I would spend all day doing it. But if I only had 15 minutes one day, I would just do a drawer, just open a drawer and be like, okay, what's adding value to my life? What's not? And it's what's adding value to your life right now. Because a lot of times we keep things that used to add value to our lives or may in the future. And the minimalists use this phrase, it's only keep things just for when, not just in case. So keeping the things that you know you'll actually use, like for real, and not just keeping things like, oh, I might use these later. And one of the things that the minimalists suggest is the 20-20 rule, which is like, if you can replace it for less than $20 in less than 20 minutes, as far as like driving somewhere and getting it, there's not a reason to keep it, probably, because a lot of times we have so much stuff around us because we're just keeping stuff around just in case, and then that just in case moment never happens. Make sense? Okay. As far as sentimental items go, I commend my blog post to you all on that. But one of the things we learned as we pared down was I ended up taking pictures of things, because a lot of times what we think about when we think about sentimental objects and why it's so hard for us to get rid of them, even if they're not serving us or adding value, is because it sparks memories. And so a picture of this object does the same exact thing, and you don't have to have the object there, and it doesn't clutter up things quite as much if you have digital pictures on your phone. So we ended up taking a lot of pictures of things, and that made me feel better when I was like, oh, I don't know, you know. Also a reminder, this sounds silly, but it was a reminder that I kept telling myself over and over, is that the memories aren't in the things. The memories are in our heads. And so although the thing sparks that memory, we don't have to keep the thing to remember the memory. We can look at a picture of it and remember the memory, you know. One of the other things that helped me was I kept like just a few things from each era in my life, which was helpful. So like, for example, my parents dumped off all the boxes of my childhood stuff. Thanks, Mom and Dad, when they were simplifying. And it's really hard when you go through and you're seeing all this stuff and you're like, how do I pare this down? And so I was like, okay, you know, I'm going to keep like the 2 most important things from when I was 10 years old and younger. And then I'm going to keep 2 most important things from when I was a teenager. And then I'm going to keep 2 most important things from when I was in college. And that seemed to help me. Again, these are not rules. These are just things that helped me. So you can come up with your own guidelines that help you through doing these types of things with sentimental items and just things in general. Other thoughts or questions?
I really like the way you're going through this now, because you're giving us really practical ideas, and I'm actually taking notes. Like you said, you know, 1 drawer at a time, or think about what are your favorite clothes? Does it make you feel good? You know, there are things in your closet that don't make you feel good and you keep them. And if you can replace it for less than $20 or take a picture, those are really good practical ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And again, these are things that have worked for me personally that I've sort of cultivated over time. But I hand them to you and try them on. And one of the best things about minimalism is that you can experiment. So if you try one of these guidelines and it doesn't work for you, try a different guideline. Just experiment and see what works. These are not hard and fast rules, as I said before. So thanks. Other thoughts or questions about any of that? Other questions about maybe some practical stuff? We talked about stuff. We haven't really talked about the other aspects of life, but I think that will come as we continue probably.
I think what's a challenge is sometimes even just doing these things takes a lot of time, and it's a challenge for what's important in life, and yet it has to be done if you haven't done it so far.
Right.
But like some of like the sentimental things are like family members who have passed away, or photo albums, and a lot of photos, and there's so much that's available to do digitally, but it still can take a lot of time to get a system set up or to work on that, or that's, you know, I think a big thing that when you have lots of those kind of things.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why it's important to know the why of why you're doing this. That's going to sustain you because I promise you there will be moments where you're like, ugh, this is taking a long time. But it's totally worth it because you want to clear the way for the things that matter most. And that's what you need to focus on. That's the general why. You may have a personal why. My personal why was more related to clearing the space so that I didn't have to spend time and energy on things. I have finite energy because I'm a chronically ill human being. And so I was spending time and energy on things that weren't the most important things. And I wanted to clear that way. So all of you probably have a personal reason for doing it as well. So hold on to that tightly as you do it and take breaks. I mean, you don't have to necessarily put a time frame on it. I suggest that just because it'll keep you on track. But you don't have to do it in 6 months like I did. I had to because we moved. You can do it in a year. And that's okay, you know, or be like, you know what, I'm going to go through this one photo album today, you know, make little steps in progress. One of the things I suggest with pictures, we scan all our pictures. I have a couple photo albums for like the most important pictures, but everything else is digital. There's still digital clutter, right? That's still a thing, but it's a lot less maddening than personal clutter. So if you have boxes and boxes of photos, which we did, I strongly suggest scanning. And if you don't have a scanner, they're actually not too expensive if you want to invest in a scanner. And it takes some time, but you know what we do? We put on a good TV show and we scan things as we go. So it doesn't even feel too bad. We're watching TV while we're doing it. So you could also listen to podcasts while you do it, you know, make it fun for yourself. Great. So one of the things I noticed when I was watching the documentary on minimalism on Netflix was that the minimalists kept saying, everyone's looking for meaning. And the implication being minimalism helps you uncover that meaning. But from a Christian perspective, I'm like, well, we know the meaning, Jesus. I wonder if anyone is connecting the minimalism lifestyle to the Christian faith and spirituality. And so at the end of 2017, I was like, I really want to read more about that. And so I searched on Google, and guess what? No one really was at the time. There were a couple scattered articles here and there, but no one was doing this in depth, which struck me as very odd because in the documentary, they talked about how minimalism had existed for about 10 years at that point, in its current form anyway. Simplicity and simple living has, you know, existed since the ancient spiritual fathers and mothers who went to the desert. But as far as minimalism as its current version had existed for a decade or so at that point, and no one had really been talking about in depth what it meant to be a Christian and do this type of lifestyle. So I was like, why is no one doing this? I should do this. And so that's how I started my blog. Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So what does this abundant life look like, and what does society tell us that abundant life should look like versus what we know it should look like and what Jesus wants for us. Those are two very different things a lot of the time, right? And we can talk about consumer culture and why keeping us dissatisfied and constantly buying things is serves those who make the money and not necessarily the people who are buying the things, because we've all been somewhere where we bought something that we didn't necessarily need, right? Or even want sometimes, which is just odd, but we do it. So Jesus says, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. I love that. Questions or comments on any of that?
Becca, this is Teresa, and your choice of John 10:10 and the abundant life is a really, it just struck me, because here we're talking about minimalism, and you're pairing minimalism, which sounds like less, with this biblical notion of abundance. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the significance of that, because it really struck me.
Yeah. And actually, my publisher said the same thing, which is why my upcoming book is Simple Steps. It's called Christian Minimalism, Simple Steps in Abundant Living is the subtitle. And it sounds like a paradox, right? As you said, because you're like, well, you're talking about minimal and paring things down, but then you're also talking about living abundantly. And so what this means is abundant living that Jesus is talking about is focusing on what matters most. That's an abundant life, because it's not paring things down just to pare things down. It's to pare things down so that we can actually have our life abundantly filled with the things that matter. Maybe not as filled as it was before with the things that didn't matter, but once we pare it down enough, we can really cultivate what's most important and spend our resources and time and energy on that. And that's the abundant life that Jesus wants for us. Jesus doesn't want us spending our resources on things that don't matter, or spending 10 hours a day watching TV that maybe not be adding value to our lives. Sometimes we need to tune out and watch something mindless, but I think a lot of, I can say this for myself, I spent a lot of time watching TV on things that didn't add value to my life. And we really pared down what we watch and why we watch it. That was one of the things we did when we went on this journey. So that's just one example, but Jesus came so that we could live life to the full, abundantly. And a lot of us just aren't, because we're buried under stuff or commitments or obligations or time commitments that just aren't serving us. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Other comments, questions?
I just got a thought when you talk about time and you talked about TV and talking about what matters. And I've been relatively new, on this social media and Facebook, and I finally realized that I kind of needed, I have in the last year or so realized I need it for being in touch with family that posts things on Facebook. When we talk about relationships matter, then that's something that matters, if that's a way I can be in touch with them. But yet I just kind of resent the time, because sometimes you go on there and then there's other things you think, well, there's so many things posted, and you think, well, it's worthwhile, or maybe I should know this, or maybe I should know that. And I really kind of resent the time out of my day, because when you talk about what matters, that's really a fine line to have the discipline to see what matters on there, the relationships you want to be in touch with. But other things are, even if it's important in those people's lives, it's not a priority for me. So that's a challenge, I think, when you talk about time.
Right. Yeah. And the problem is those social media platforms are actually created to suck you in. Like that's why they, you know what I mean? Like they want you to spend more time on there. And so some of the practical ways that some people have helped with that is some people only check their social media twice a day, morning and evening. Sometimes people will be like, I'm going to check on 3 people and then log off. You can find out ways to Limit that for yourself. I mean, we all get sucked in time and time again. So it's helpful. That's another good example of things that our time sucks. Like, it's easy to go on Facebook, for example, just start scrolling through the newsfeed and then be like, oh, where'd that hour go? Another way is on a lot of social media things, you can do settings on who is in your newsfeed. Because quite frankly, I don't need to see what people are eating for dinner every night. Like, that is just not something that adds value to my life personally. And so I've really pared down the people that I follow on social media so that I'm not seeing things that aren't adding value. And I'm not spending time and energy looking at those things. So that's another way to do that as well. And then in addition, following people that I know will add value, that are posting things that are worthwhile. Good? Mm-hmm. All right. So just like the minimalists had the aspects of life that matter most that they offered, I offer what matters most in Christian minimalism. And you'll see that there's a lot of crossovers with what the minimalists did, but there's also some differences. And they're not in any order, any particular order. Fellowship, stewardship, self-care, spiritual growth, vocation, and service. So in scriptures, Jesus is pretty clear about this stuff. The goal of life is not material wealth, fame, or human accomplishments. And he constantly speaks against deriving our meaning from these things. For example, here's some examples. There's a lot more than this, but here's just a few snapshots. The disciples were arguing about who's the greatest, and Jesus tells them last of all, to be last of all and servant of all. He also says the last shall be first, and the Son of Man was called not to be served, but to serve. And Jesus actually talks a lot about money and material possessions. 16 of the 38 parables Jesus told are about money and possessions. And in the Gospels, 1 out of every 10 verses has to do with money, believe it or not. And in the whole Bible, more than 2,000 verses are about money and or possessions. Now, like we said before, minimalism is not just about money and possessions, but it's a good chunk of it. And so obviously this matters to Jesus, so it's supposed to matter to us. Questions or comments on any of that? Mm. Okay. Y'all look like you're thinking hard. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. All right. I like to say that Jesus had a minimalist lifestyle as well. One of the quotes is, "You shall love the Lord with your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and prophets." Now, what that sounds to me is Jesus took the 600 something laws that the folks had at the time and narrowed it down to 2. What does that sound like? Minimalism. He took all those laws and narrowed it down to the 2 most important ones that focus on the aspects of life that matter most. Comments on that? This is also one of my favorite quotes from Jesus. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So why do you think this could be considered the mission statement for Christian minimalism? Any thoughts on that?
Becca, this is Teresa. So, when I hear that, it's like on the one hand, like a refining of what matters most, right? So that minimalism is about focusing on what matters most, but there's also something else here. So if my treasure around me is a lot of stuff, then that's where my heart and attention gets pulled, right? Mm-hmm. But if my treasure is, my daughter and my nieces and these relationships, and yes, I need to care for my house, and no, I'm not very good at doing handy things around it, but you know, with fewer things, my heart doesn't, you know, my heart gets pulled toward what really matters. Like I don't want my heart pulled in the direction of maintaining or acquiring a lot of stuff. I really want my heart pulled toward my kid and the people who are closest to me, and then, you know, outer circles. So.
Yep, definitely. Thank you. Other thoughts? Well, I encourage you to continue thinking about this as we move forward. I'm going to tell you the meaning of life today. Everybody ready? So as Christians, we're called to be countercultural, as in our consumer culture, and strive to be minimalists in a consumer society, because we know that our life's meaning is not wrapped up in material things, wealth, fame, fortune, or human accomplishments or accolades, because Jesus tells that. It's through Jesus Christ and what he did for us by dying on the cross and his resurrection that our lives have meaning. And we have one life. Anyone heard YOLO before? You only live once. How can we focus on what matters most to love and serve God and others? And how can God help us do this? And those are the questions that we can ask ourselves every day, because that helps reframe what is giving us meaning and how we live our lives and focusing on what matters most. Comments, questions on any of that? All right. I love this quote from Henry Nouwen. I'm a huge Henry Nouwen fan. If you haven't read Henry Nouwen before, I commend to you all of his works, which are very numerous. Pick one, you can't go wrong. He says, spiritual identity means we are not what we do or what people say about us, and we are not what we have. We are beloved daughters and sons of God. And that is what our identity is beloved children of God. We don't need to find our identity in things or what we do. And I think often why we overburden ourselves with stuff and time commitments and obligations is because we realize we're deriving our meaning and our identity from those things. And that's not what we are called to do as children of God. Make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my shopping fast. So one of the things I learned about myself when I watched the minimalism documentary was I had fallen into some pretty bad habits around using the resources God gives me. So because I was chronically ill, when I wasn't feeling well, I would fill the void of not feeling well with online shopping. And I had actually become addicted to online shopping. And I don't use that word lightly because I do have friends who are in recovery from substance abuse. It was an addiction. I would go online. I would get a rush when I clicked to buy the thing. I would get another rush when it came in the mail. And then what would happen a few days later? I didn't have that rush anymore. And so then I'd have to go do it again and again and again. And I didn't want to do that. I knew that wasn't serving me. That wasn't serving God well, wasn't serving others well. So I did a shopping fast for a year. It was pretty extreme. I wouldn't necessarily suggest you start there unless you have an extreme addiction to online shopping like I did. But for the whole year, I had a list of accepted things that I was allowed to buy, like food, so I could stay alive. Toiletries, but only when I ran out. Books, because I was in a doctoral program and needed to buy books for that, but not extra books unless it was going to add value. And that was pretty much it. I could also, if something broke or wore out, I could replace it as long as I got rid of the original thing. And for a whole year, I didn't buy anything except on that approved list. And what it really made me evaluate was how I spent money without thinking a lot of times, and how I could be a lot more intentional about how I consumed and about how I used my resources. And that was super helpful for me. I've had friends since then done shorter versions of that, like a shopping fast for a month or 3 months, just to help reevaluate how they're using their money. And since then, we've come up with a budget and guidelines around money spending and things like that that have really helped Will and I continue that process, even though I'm no longer doing the shopping fast. Because I wasn't just doing a shopping fast for the rest of your life. But it was helpful for me to kind of get myself out of those bad habits that I had fallen into for some time. So you may ask, or have been thinking during this, how is Christian minimalism a thing during or after a pandemic? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because we're going to talk about that today. So we said that Christian minimalism is living the abundant life Jesus wants for us by focusing on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else. And it's a whole lifestyle reorientation. It's not just about material possessions, as we talked about before, and it also includes our use of time, energy, the environment, spiritual gifts and skills, money, and possessions. So some people have called the pandemic forced minimalism. Stay-at-home orders, quarantine protocols, and essential businesses only forced us into a more minimalistic lifestyle for a bit. It also forced us to reevaluate what's most important in our lives. And lots of people, though, attempted to self-medicate through comfort buying, comfort baking and eating, all of those types of things. If you did that, it's okay. I did too. More the comfort baking and eating. Ultimately, the pandemic gave us an opportunity to refocus our lives around what's most important during and post-pandemic. So although a global pandemic is a horrible thing to have to deal with, it's kind of a cool thing in the sense that it gave us this opportunity to refocus our lives if we choose to take that opportunity. We choose whether we want to do the work to refocus our own life with God's help. And it already has started. The pressure will be on post-pandemic to spend to restart the economy. Something to think about. How can we do this without falling into dissatisfied consumerism? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but something to think about. So, as we said before, the 6 most important aspects of life in Christian minimalism, according to me, because I decided on these, is fellowship, self-care, stewardship, spiritual growth, vocation, and service. And we're actually going to look at each of these during the pandemic. All right, fellowship. Being in close quarters with immediate family during the pandemic meant more quality time with one another if you lived with them, but also possibly magnified issues that needed to be worked on. Especially if for families, if people were trying to work from home and take care of children and deal with spouses all at once, which is not always helpful sometimes. And for those of us who may not live with family members or live with minimal family members, it also helped us realize the need for social interaction with loved ones outside of immediate family. And we got creative, right? We found different ways to talk with people. We maybe spent more time on the phone or on social media to connect with people that way, or other ways through the internet or things like that. Trying to connect with others through ways where we don't necessarily have to be next to each other. We also got creative with how we connected with our faith communities. A lot of congregations started doing stuff online because we couldn't gather and sing together and worship together in the same way. This is an example. Hi, everyone. It's cool that I didn't have to travel to Minnesota, though. But also cool that everyone can join in from their house, eating their breakfast and drinking their coffee, which is also kind of cool. All right. Self-care. We may have had more time to take care of our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health and experimented with self-care avenues since we were home more. We may have also realized that our self-care needs changed because of isolation and or family underfoot and pivoted accordingly. I personally, I will say I am not used to working from home and seeing my spouse 24/7. I love him dearly, but that's just not something we were used to. And so that took a little getting used to and figuring out ways to have time on our own, even though we were stuck in the same house together all the time, if that makes sense. Any thoughts or comments on or questions on self-care? All right. Stewardship. Having less ways to spend money means that we might have become more aware of what we spend on and why, though, of course, online shopping is still a thing. Having less on our schedules helped us to slow down a bit and recognize how we use our time and energy. And staying put actually made our impact on the environment a lot less. I saw a picture of before and after, and I think it was Beijing, and it was like all smog and everything. And then when everyone was on stay-at-home orders, it was completely clear and you could see the whole city. So it was pretty incredible how we realized how we're using the Earth's resources a little bit more than we probably should. And we may realize how much stuff is around us in our homes because we're in our homes a lot more, and maybe we wanted to buy less and get rid of a lot. Anybody necessarily feel like that? Raise your hand. You realize how much stuff you had now that you're in your house a lot more? Yeah. Happens to the best of us. Okay. Spiritual growth. A life or death global pandemic tends to get people thinking about the meaning of life and God. It just does. Many had spiritual awakenings, and honestly, how to pray and prayer became some of the most searched terms on Google during this pandemic, which was pretty incredible. Many people had more space in their schedule to devote to Bible reading, prayer, or devotions during the pandemic. And many people realized the need for a connection to the divine and started cultivating a prayer life that maybe hadn't before. And as we said, faith communities got creative in ways to have faith conversations and have Bible study times together in addition to worshiping together. Thoughts on spiritual growth? Has your spiritual growth practices changed during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Anyone want to share anything about that?
I do. This is more of a kind of a commercial for Mount Olivet, but the Wednesday mornings of the opening of the church, if any of you have experienced that, they open the church from 10 to 12 now on Wednesdays. That's very powerful. And I would, I would encourage you all to notice that, participate in that if you think that's calling to you. It was really cool. It might be actually on a pragmatic basis, a chance for the church to practice how they're going to reopen, because they roped off pews and whatnot, got directional things going. But I was quite moved when I attended.
Great. Thank you for that. It's a great opportunity.
Mhm.
Vocation. Changes in employment status during the pandemic caused a good chunk of the country to reevaluate their jobs and ask themselves if they're called to do something else or have a vocation separate from how they make their money. And changes in how we work, for example, working remotely during the pandemic, may have had similar results. And this is just a fun fact that I found out from the ELCA churchwide office, at least in Lutheran circles. I don't know what it's like in other denominational circles, but whenever there is a local disaster, historically 1/3 of the clergy from that area end up changing calls. And we have a global pandemic, which means that everyone is experiencing a disaster. So lots of clergy will be going elsewhere. And what does this mean for the church? Good question. Service. During a pandemic, serving others has never been more important. People have gotten creative with how to meet needs because a lot of the ways that we've met people's needs previously were just not able to be done because of the pandemic. And so, for example, a lot of people in the synod I work in did porch pantries. Has anyone heard of this? Yes? Basically, people would leave food out on their porch for people, and anyone who wanted to could come up and take it for free. And so there were a lot of these in neighboring towns that I saw. Also, in a lot of areas, children who go to school depend on school meals for regular meals. And so there were feeding initiatives that people started to feed those children and families who depend on school meals. And also resting places for healthcare workers, because this is super stressful for essential workers and healthcare workers and things like that. Power companies, gas companies, etc., extended bill pay timelines, which was really great because they know that people are in a pinch a little bit now. And here's a suggestion: if you got a stimulus check but you don't need it, how can it be used by others if you share it? Thoughts or comments on any of this?
Well, I do know, of course, the Mount Olivet has the drive-by food twice a week for the anybody who feels that they need it. It's a great outreach ministry. And they also have food bank donations on Mondays.
Great. Good. So that's awesome. It means y'all are doing your part to help people during this time and in general, right? I'm sure the feeding ministry is not new.
It's true.
Great. Other things? Okay. Will the changes last? Do you think people will continue to live more minimally even after the pandemic is done? Here are some things that could affect that. As we talked about before, pressure to stimulate the economy by buying things we don't need. I don't know if you felt that pressure. I already have. We could go back to autopilot, back to how we lived before because it's comfortable and easy to do. We could overschedule ourselves and start spending more because we're able to again. Other obstacles you can think of. Any other obstacles that would keep us from living more minimally once we get to post-pandemic? Well, keep thinking about that because it will happen. This is my blog. I post twice a month with thoughts on Christian minimalism and ways to simplify your life. And sometimes the blog posts are very practical and sometimes they're very theoretical and sometimes they're both. So for example, I talk about the concept of silence and what that means for us in the next blog post that will be posted soon. Some of them are very practical, as we talked about. The one on sentimental items was very practical as far as what to do with them. So it's a wide range, but hopefully if you want to learn more, you can do that. And also I have a book coming out, which is very exciting. May 2021, it's Christian Minimalism, Simple Steps for Abundant Living. It's through Church Publishing, which is the publishing arm of the Episcopal Church. So we are fully ecumenical today. So check that out when it comes out in May if you would like to learn more as well.
Thank you so much, Becca. It's fun to get to see you and to hear about this. I thank you for doing some writing for us on retreat where you are and joining us. I'm also wondering if you could just close us with a short prayer.
Sure, let's pray. God, we thank you so much for this time together of learning and conversation and thinking about new and exciting ways to live the life that you want for us, Lord. And we ask that you would help us point out those things that we need to simplify, Lord. Help us to know how we can live that abundant life in you. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Great to see you all, or hear you all, or know that you're present. Take care, everyone. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.